Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Saghar Sadeghian, who is at Yale as the Henry Hart Rice Family Foundation Fellow and Lecturer. Her research focuses on the notions of nationality, constitution, and modern institutions in Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan during the 19th and 20th centuries. She is specifically interested in minority groups in the Middle East. Today we talk with Professor Sadeghian about her manuscript titled Non-Muslims and the Constitutional Revolution, A Question of Identity. Welcome, Professor Sadeghian.
Thank you.
Let's begin with an overview of your book. I understand you're still working on it, so tell us a bit about it.
Yes, this is a manuscript based on my PhD thesis, which I wrote in French. And it's about the question of national identity and religious identity concerning non-Muslim population in Iran. And I focus on four major communities in Iran: Zoroastrian, Jews, Christians, and Baha'is. And in the heart of the Iranian society, circa 1890 to 1911, which was a kind of a part of the period of transition toward modernization somehow. And I try to show these communities in at different levels, national, local, and international. And I try to show how the constitutional revolution, which happened in 1906, influenced or changed or may not change the situation of these communities. And I also try to show the role of these communities in the revolution.
So tell me how you're doing the research for the book.
This is a historical research, so I need to consult lots of primary sources beside the existing literature. So I read lots of travelogues, memoirs, journals, and some archival documents. For this research, which is very noteworthy contribution, is the documents it introduces to the academic world for the first time. Because I consulted several archival institutions in Iran, France, and Britain, including national archives, diplomatic archives, and some archives of some institutions, including Alliance Israélite Universelle and the Lazaristes, the Congregation of the Mission of France. But something important is about the Foreign Affairs archives in Iran, in Tehran. It is very important because at the time there was a special department in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs which was exclusively responsible for non-Muslim cases. Edare Melal Mutanawwe'e, which is literally the Department of Diverse People, but in fact it was the Department of Non-Muslims. So there I could find lots of collections of non-Muslim cases, individuals and groups, which illustrate the Iranian society with regard to non-Muslim population. It's very important.
Okay, very good, very good. So tell us a bit about the four groups you look at. You look at the national, local, international level. So talk about their daily lives a little bit. Tell us about them.
Yes. If you want to illustrate a kind of daily life of these minorities, Zoroastrians, Christians, Jews, and Baha'is, one could see that they had their own quarters separated from the majority, Muslim majority. These quarters could be inside or outside the cities and could have walls or gates or could not have them. But the goal was to isolate the population. And there were some regulations and codes for them when they were coming outside of their quarters. But these rules were very arbitrary and local. So sometimes, for example, you see that they were not allowed to have their markets or shops inside the city. Sometimes they had to follow some dress codes. For example, sometimes, especially for Zoroastrians and Jews, they had to wear a patch or a kind of, they call it vasle, kind of badge to be recognized in the society. And sometimes they were not allowed to come outside when it was raining because non-Muslims were considered impure or najis.
Okay.
So they thought that during the rain, this impurity would wash off.
Wow.
And sometimes they were not allowed to ride a horse or bicycle, and that was a sign of inferiority or humiliation. And they could be distinguished because of their, dress codes and appearance, and sometimes because of their language or accent, and sometimes because they were following the rituals of their religions.
Right.
But the most similar community to Muslims were the Babi Baha'i community. As far as dress codes or language were concerned, they were so similar, so they could not be so easily distinguished in the community because the Babism appeared in 1844 in Iran, and obviously the first followers were the converts from other major religions and Muslims in particular. But something important is that despite all these distinctions, religious minorities would communicate and interact with the majority. They would trade, they would marry each other, and
Oh, they would marry each
yeah,
other?
they would marry.
That's interesting.
There were some rules, of course, but that would happen. And they were in communication with each other in the daily life. And it's important to know that when we are reading documents about the time, normally we are reading something exceptional because normally we write reports when something unusual happens, something abnormal or occasional happens. So it's important to know that when we are reading the documents, we should not generalize it through the whole society for all the time. So if we bear this in mind, we can see that there were not very rigid borders, and the borders were flexible, and sometimes regulations would be postponed or even ignored because of economic or political reasons.
Very interesting. You also talk about the constitutional revolution. What was the role of these religious communities in the revolution?
Yes, the constitutional revolution happened in 1906 in Iran, and it's very controversial because the research about this event is very varied, and their interpretations are very conflicting. But for me, it's important to focus on the goals of the Constitution, in special one slogan that was Iran for all Iranians. So in 1906, the Shah of Iran decreed an order, a farman, and gave the permission to establish the first parliament in Iran. So the revolutionaries, didn't accept that order because they thought they forced the Shah to change the order because he mentioned Islamic parliament, and they had this demand to have a kind of national parliament. So they changed the order, and it was very promising. The situation was very somehow democratic, and for the same reason, non-Muslims participated very actively in the constitutional revolution, and they helped the revolution financially. They participated to the army, and they gave lots of ideas, and they helped it culturally. But when the parliament was established, Baha'is and the other group of the Babi Baha'is, Azalis, were not allowed to have a representative in the parliament.
Did that cause trouble?
Sorry?
Did that make for conflict between the groups?
No, they were somehow the pioneers of the revolution, but for the same reason maybe, and because they were not a recognized religion, they were not Ahl Kitab, something that a religion that could live inside an Islamic context. They didn't have a right to have a representative in the parliament.
I see.
And then Jews and Christians had the right to have one representative each, but they were advised not to use this right. So instead they chose two mujtahids, clerics, Islamic clerics, to be their representatives in the parliament. And only Zoroastrians, they managed to send a representative in the parliament, a very famous and rich merchant who was claimed to be the representative of the merchants and not the Zoroastrians. So that was the case of the presence of the non-Muslims in the constitutional revolution.
Okay. So what are some of your findings regarding the different political, social, and economic aspects of Iranian society with regard to these different religions?
Yeah, there are lots of findings, but I would like to give you an example to show how it worked, how complicated it was.
It sounds very complicated.
So, yeah. So I would say a little bit about the economic situation of non-Muslims and talk about it a little bit, because at the time, non-Muslims were not allowed to choose their own job. They were not allowed to do any job they wish. Okay. There were some restrictions. For example, they would only handle food and drink to their own co-religionists. They were not allowed to deal with Muslims in this sense. And on the other hand, we had this Muslim community who were not also allowed to practice some of the services that the society was in demand. They wanted it, but Muslims were not allowed to work with some special materials. For example, they were not allowed to work with gold, chemical liquids, or they were not allowed to get engaged in dance and music or producing and selling alcoholic beverages. So in this sense, non-Muslims had the monopoly of these activities. These restrictions enabled non-Muslims to join different levels and different classes, social classes. And one group which was very successful and they did well in economic activities were the merchants, non-Muslim merchants. They normally had a kind of connection and network inside and outside the country with their own co-religionists and families, and that would help them to manage their trade. And sometimes they had the monopoly of some trades. So they were very successful, and this success helped them to ignore some of the restrictions that would be imposed to non-Muslim communities. At local level. For example, they would ignore the dress codes. They would not wear badges, things like this. And to be successful, on the other hand, would raise a kind of animosity or resentment from the other side of the society. So Muslim merchants did not like this. So they would find a kind of religious pretext to limit their activities. For example, they would force them to have their markets or shops outside the city, or they would force them to pay some extra taxes, for example, something like jizya or gifts, something similar. And sometimes they would incite the population to, under a kind of religious pretext, to attack their houses or shops. That would sometimes be encouraged by clerics as well. A merchant, a non-Muslim merchant, might be attacked or even be killed because the kind of religious or political authority was in debt with him. So sometimes that would work as well. So they would kill him just to get rid of the debt. And this is a situation, and you can see that this discrimination would sometimes encourage non-Muslims to go and ask for asylums or ask a new nationality from other countries such as Britain, Russia, Ottoman Empire, or India. And that would bring other countries in the case, and there were frictions, negotiations regarding the non-Muslims in this kind of political relationship between Iran and other countries. So you can see that there are different groups from different religions in different levels of the society at different levels. And it's not easy to decide that, just point out some of them.
Sure.
I would use Foucault's expression to say that there was a kind of power network, and non-Muslim community was a part of this network. And to use Agamben's word, I would say that borders and distinctions were blurred. It was not very rigid. And I would say that these members of the community had a kind of liquid identity, both in religion and both in nationality.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you so much for having me.
For more information about Professor Sadeghian and her research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.